through some of the slides more quickly on a few of these areas, and I'll probably tell you rather than ask you for some of the information. And I think some of these you're probably more familiar with than others if you've been teaching the course for a while. And one of those is probably, if you have taught this course in the past, you probably know our next object. So we're going now to something very different. We're going to India before the coming of Islam, which actually never reached the southern heartland of Tamil Nadu. It never controlled this very southern part of India, which has its own regional traditions and had its own great empires. And the greatest of these was the Chola dynasty, which really comes into its own in the 10th and 11th and 12th century. A lot of that under the king Rajaraja Chola I, who expands the empire. Here was their capital at Tanjore or Tanjavur, and he expands their influence not only within India. All this gray is direct control under the Cholas from the central capital, but also to Sri Lanka. And that civil war in Sri Lanka that just ended less than, 10 years ago, was a result of the Chola conquest from over 1,000 years ago, which made the top half Tamil, Hindu, and the bottom of Sri Lanka Buddhist in a different kingdom. And so, but they were a maritime dynasty, which then extended influence far into Southeast Asia. So you see in the purple on these maps, receiving tribute in kind of a feudal-like state from Indonesia, Malaysia, coastal, peninsular, Southeast Asia. So it was a huge, very powerful dynasty. And so they had access to a lot of resources. And I just show you a little bit about the arts that were developing here. This is early, so it's 10th century Chola temple. Just plant this in your mind, some of the basic Hindu temple components. These were small. The dynasty is not yet a world power. And this, I believe, this temple was actually built by one of the queens, and I'll show you how it's associated with the queen. But notice, Hindu temple, this is simple, small. A cella called the Garbhagriha, and a pillared porch called a mandapa. Two basic components of any Hindu temple. So we see it in this early Chola temple. These were carved granite, so not an easy stone to work with. And the imagery, you see these stone niche figures. This is cut, again, in granite or greenstone, a very hard stone. And look what they do with the figures in the 10th century. Oh, like life-size, like a person, fleshy, very naturalistic, but also idealized. That's when they begin to develop the bronze sculptures in the Chola dynasty. So this 10th century period, and some of these we know because they're portraits. So this is a queen who's recognizable by her features. She's so human, yet she's perfect, sensuous, engaging, and here she is being depicted here and here as the goddess Parvati, the wife of Shiva, the great god. So we have this beautiful sculptural style developing in bronze in concert with their stone sculptures that ornament their temples. Now Rajaraja, when he takes over Sri Lanka and goes international, he brings back a lot of wealth. He has now established himself as an empire, and they build an imperial temple in their capital city, the great temple of Tanjore, 200 feet high in granite, to give you a sense of scale. And they began to commission many, many, many of this sculpture. This is Shiva Nataraja, probably a very familiar form to you. There's one from the Met in your image set. This is the one from Cleveland, clearly imperial sculpture from Tanjore, from the capital, and one of the greatest outside of India. And the subject matter is interesting because although you have dancing Shiva called Natesha in earlier medieval depictions of Shiva, you don't have Nataraja with the same gestures. So where does this come from? Here's the capital. Here's the city on the coast at the river delta of Chidambaram. This Calvary River here that Tanjore is just to the south of. This is an incredible, important area for transit, for control. And as they grow in importance in the 10th century and then the 11th, the Cholas began to invest a lot of money and interest in Chidambaram because this is a great sacred center in South India. It is the home of a local cult of Shiva. It's often called the Tilai cult or Tilai temple. Tilai is the region around the city of beautiful trees, forest, called Tilai, and they associate him as the Lord of Tilai. And Shiva, apparently, in the local lore, came there and would wander the groves of the city, and he would perform dances. And so this is his place, this special form of Shiva. And the Cholas extend their influence here. They began patronizing the temple. It was a Chola king who first put gold on this wooden hall where Shiva Nataraja is enshrined. And they also began commissioning many images of Nataraja. So this is the Nataraja gallery at the Tanjore Museum. And a friend of mine who's been always compares this to like going to see the Rockettes. Because it's a stunning display. I mean, it's such an iconic, powerful image, and it's one thing when you encounter one, but it really is something when you see them in multiple. And you can see, actually, even in this photo, there's slightly different style. These are different workshops. There are imperial workshops in the capital of Tanjore making these bronzes, but also at local temples and other towns around Tamil Nadu. And you can see over time, but also by region, the style of the sculpture changes a little bit. These are amazing. Cast bronze or copper alloy, lost wax method. Sure, that's how they get the wonderful, flashy details. They're solid. Solid. It's unusual, and it's damn near impossible to make. This is the medieval world. Greek bronzes, the greatest early bronzes in the history of art, hollow. So we're talking about ancient recipes being applied with such care and precision that they were able to cast them solid and they wouldn't bubble, they wouldn't crack, they wouldn't break. Nobody else in the history of art until the modern period tried to do this. So when you talk about bronze sculpture, great bronze art in the world, everybody looks at the Cholas as this high point. And they're right, because they couldn't replicate it until the modern period with modern science. So they're amazing, just amazing works technically and beautifully. And Shiva is so associated with dance, said that he developed, it's believed that Nataraja developed the 108 great dance forms, which form the basis of Indian, at least South Indian classical dance. So you see some dancers here in a gallery, my gallery actually, making the pose of Nataraja and some of the asanas, which are associated with him. And so he is the patron deity of dance, both in the past and today. So here he is, and this is a different version. It's ours, but I wanted to show it to you because it doesn't have the mandorla of flame, which is unfortunate, but because it doesn't, you can really get around it. And so what I want you to look at, and we'll just do more looking, you know what the symbolism is. I'm sure it's in the textbooks. But what I want you to get is the aesthetics of this piece. The way that the limbs move and bend, almost the way that a tensed muscle would, but it's still soft. There's an ease about it. It suggests motion, but it's frozen. There's something, and it's engaging you. When you see these Chola icons and sculptures, they look right at you, almost like a person greeting you. There's something so human about them, but they're perfect. They're not real. They can make bronze look like flesh. Not every culture could do that. So you can look at it, them in detail. Amazing proportions with these broad, round shoulders, little waists, and little bits of flesh. Like, oh, there's always a pool of flesh. I love Indian art. You're allowed to be fleshy. It's like the only place in the history of art where the body and all of its fleshiness is celebrated. It's part of what makes you human, and it's what makes an image of the divine human on your level. So, you know, the drum, the rhythm of existence, the rhythm of its dance, you know, the fear not gesture, and he points to the foot was about to move in this great dance, the fire that will purge and cleanse the earth, purify the earth, the dance that he performs. And in mythology, at the end of the Kali Yuga, the great dark era, you know, the era at the end of the cycle of time when we have to start over again, you know, when times of war and distress and times of Congress not being able to pass a bill and, you know, no health care and all these bad things coming together. This is the time Shiva will come. And you'll hear him with the drum. You'll hear the thunk, thunk, thunk. And he will come and he will have the cleansing fire. And he will begin his dance. And as he begins it in this whirl of fire, he will bring an end to the era of darkness and a rebirth of a new golden age. And in his dance, through this purification, through this act, he will crush ignorance, what is blackening our time. And that's not a baby. It's a dwarf, a nature imp that's meant here to symbolize ignorance, which is a negative quality. And just look at the rendering of the body. The weight of the limbs, the roundness, the flesh, the bends. These Chola sculptures are unbelievable. And then how were they used? These, what became a political icon for the Chola dynasty, because Nataraja then began being dispersed in every temple. These grand, grand images. It almost became some scholars argue it is a state symbol for the Cholas. They are used two ways. On most of the time, they live in a temple sub-shrine. So I'll walk you through one. This is a great South Indian temple complex in the city of Kanchipuram. You enter through great gateways into the temple, and later in later dynasties often build new walls and new gateways further out. So it's often like going through an onion as you walk through these spaces, starting from the tallest structures to smaller and smaller spaces, across courtyards, through pillared halls, and now you begin to enter into interior spaces. And you will find sub-shrines, not the main shrine of one of these South Indian temples, but particularly We're talking about Shiva. So Shiva, the bronze, lives in a sub-shrine where it is enshrined and worshipped in a form of worship we call puja. And in puja, it's a ritual offering where you make offerings to the god, usually through a priest as a mediator. And through Sanskrit prayers, the priest shares the offering to the god, and then some of those offerings are blessed and given back, and you take those. So if it's a flower, you can take the flower with you. If it's food, you can taste the food because it's been blessed by God. It's called prasad. And the other important aspect of this puja is when you're there in front of the enshrined live icon, you are looking at it, and it, like that Nataraja with its carved, incised eyes, is looking at you. And because God, the deity, has been invoked into the image, that means you are looking at God and God is looking at you, and there is an exchange of divine blessing, and that is called darshan, divine seeing. And it's fundamental to the practice of Hinduism. And you can experience that through seeing these images. And when they're under worship, they're treated like human beings. They're washed in the morning. They're put to sleep at night. They're dressed. They're given garlands and flowers, perfumes, and the food that you bring in, and offered flames. And these are presented before the deity during puja. And then, on special days of the year, special religious festivals, those images, which are considered to be portable images in the sub-shrines, these bronzes, are taken out on temple carts from their shrine by the priests. And this is the great temple cart at Chidambaram, filled, usually wooden, filled with carvings. And then they will be processed through the city. So here you can see the same cart, and it's been wonderfully draped and decorated, and it becomes a replica of a temple. And this is the tower on top, and the flag, and so you know the god is in there. It's live. And the priest sits with the bronzes, and others help pull it manually. They still do this. The term juggernaut, you always hear it in football. He's a juggernaut. Can't stop him. Well, that term comes from India. It comes from the great cart festival, temple cart festival in Puri in Orissa, where the local deity is called Juggernaut. And the British came up with that term to apply to things that get out of control and unstoppable, because there's a point in the city that those carts they're bigger than this, they process, and they would often get out of control. They'd be on a incline, and just, and people could die because thousands of people are there to receive darshan. So that big, unstoppable force, juggernaut in the English language, comes from the unstoppable divine temple cart in Puri. And I think I have one more. I tried to blow this up, and you can even see the priest sitting here and the images ready, so you can receive darshan too as it passes through the street. All right. You can get my outline. Let's go on to Khajuraho, because I think there may be some questions here and some questions about why this temple is important. And I want to get you to at least the next object on the list as well. So now we're going from the south to the north. And to central India, to a different dynasty. Notice almost everything we've looked at is like a great work, and it's associated with a royal patron or noble, from the Mamluks and the Seljuks, the Mongols and Safavids, now the Cholas, and the Chandelas. This was a small regional kingdom that was a subordinate, a vassal state in this kind of feudal-like system in North India. And this was their capital here in central India, Khajuraho. It's like the Kansas of India. And here is a layout of the western group of temples. 25 temples survive in this, what's sometimes called a temple city. It's actually like a village today. Presumably, the archaeological remains suggest there were 80 temples. So this was a magnificent center. And we have this political group here of kind of the mature 10th, 11th century temples, which we'll look at. We have early ones spread out early when they were just a little kingdom, not very powerful. And the Jain community, which is a different religion, were also lived and established in the capital, and they have their own area with their own temples built by the same artists in the same style. So it's a wonderful place to visit. And this is a shot of some of the Western group, this kind of mature period of the Chandelas. And we'll call this group, 900, maybe a little early, to 1050 of the Common Era. And so the books often teach and illustrate Kandarya Mahadeva temple, the last temple built here, magnificent temple. And I think you can feel at ease and tell your students that to understand the style, the use of imagery, the symbolism, the ground plan, it's okay, because what they say about that temple will apply to the earlier Lakshmana temple. Let me show you what's interesting about the Lakshmana temple. Okay, here it is. And for any of you who know Michael Beasy, there he is. He's an AP Art History teacher. So the temple, compared to Kandarya Mahadev, it's a little bit shorter. It's earlier, probably constructed 930 to 950. It's consecrated in 954. It's interesting to us because the floor plan's a little bit different than most of the other temples at Khajuraho. So it still has the same idea of the pillared hall, the mandapas, in front of the inner cella where the main deity would be, and we'll show you that. But it also has 4 sub-shrines, one on each corner. And this is what's called a Panchayatana plan. I think I put that on your handout, so you have the spelling. So here's a good picture of the temple. You can see that these all sit on a very high platform, which are accessed by stairs at the front in a kind of axis with the center shrine. There's a clear separation of the kind of earthly, corrupt world, the mundane world, and an elevation to a pure space. You have to take off your shoes before you go up onto the main temple platforms at these sites. And here's the history of the Lakshmana temple. It's built by the Chandela king Yashovarman, let's say around 950. And he dies before it's finished, so it's actually dedicated by his son in an inscription at 945. This is a fascinating moment for the Chandelas because they were a little vassal state who owed their homage to a great empire that was based in the Gangetic Plain to the north, called the Pratiharas. The Pratiharas get weak. The Chandelas move in. Yashovarman sends his armies. They used to support the Pratiharas, help prop them up, but in this time of weakness, they see an opportunity. He sends his armies to the capital, and he captures an image, a sacred image from the Pratihara king. And this image is clearly associated with state power. And he brings it back to the capital, and he builds a temple for it. And that's the Lakshmana temple, and that marks the rise of the Chandelas from a vassalage to a dynasty, a kingdom in their own right, the fall of the Pratihara Empire, and it's symbolized through the building of a temple and the icon that it held. And look at the story of the icon. This inscription from 945 tells us an amazing story, supposedly given first by the king of Tibet to the king of Kashmir as a diplomatic gift, a beautiful icon. The image was then taken by force by the Pratihara king when he invaded Kashmir and made it part of his empire, and taken to the state capital. And then the Chandelas overthrow them and take it, and they form a little empire of their own. So the icon of the temple is a symbol of their kingship and their authority. So who is it? And I drew a little map. Tibet to Kashmir to the Pratihara temple, that was this big green here, Kanauj. And these guys used to be their vassal state, and then they overthrow them when they fell, and now they have a little empire right here. So this is on the dedication of the Lakshmana temple. May that Vaikuntha, which is a Vishnu, form of Vishnu icon, protect you who frightened the whole world with his roaring, and who slew the 3 demon chiefs, Kapila and others, and who possessed of one body bearing something I mistyped, and produced the howl of the boar and the man-lion. These are 2 forms of Vishnu that you see here, lion avatar and boar avatar, and human form in one image. That's Vaikuntha, this very special form. So Vaikuntha combines these in a single image. This human form with the peaceful face is the main image. Narasimha, the man-lion avatar of Vishnu, and Varaha, the boar. And what you're looking at, however, is not that icon. You're talking about an icon that would have traveled from Tibet to Kashmir. It was not a giant stone relief carving that's hundreds and hundreds of pounds. What Kashmir is famous for are these images like this: brass, gilt, inlaid, portable, but very beautiful, beautiful things. Here's also a stone sculpture from Kashmir, so you can get the style from this period. So what was being moved around, this royal gift, was probably one of these, but it hasn't survived. And so if you look at Kashmiri, Tibetan style, and this, it ain't it. So this is probably 12th century, a later reproduction made in the Khajuraho style by local artists to replace a lost image, but an image that symbols the authority of the kingdom.
Is the proportion of this one closer to real, or the proportion of this one that's longer, thinner?
Well, these Kashmiri ones are all kind of squat.
So that's closer to what you would actually see than this one.
Yeah, and this one is elongated Khajuraho style.
These ones are
Oh, yes, yes.
No, these are the distorted. Okay.
Well, they're both distorted, but I would actually say
That one's closer.
the Kashmir is very squat, so it's wrong, but it's closer. All right, so let's take a look, based again on the a big growth from the original early Hindu temple, cella, the garbhagriha, the womb chamber where the deity lives, and pillared porch. Looks a lot like Greek, doesn't it? So this is probably our earliest Hindu temple, 5th century at Sanchi. And then here's the plan of Lakshmana. So here are the sub-shrines. We don't know what they were, but you can enter the temple. You also access it by circumambulating the outside clockwise. And I'll show you that. So here you are. If you were to go up the stairs, you enter on the east. The deity is enshrined on the west. So the sun rises in the morning. It shines upon the deity in the shrine. But you would start your visit probably as a worshiper by circumambulating, going around the south side. And there's a program here, and I'm not going to get into the whole program, but you might recognize the deity you start with, Ganesha, the Hindu god of beginnings, the overcomer of obstacles. You start a cycle of Hindu prayers or ritual cycle by invoking Ganesha. It's the first deity you encounter in a niche at the temple. And that's almost standard for a Hindu temple from the medieval era. So you start here and you walk around the outside. And you're not very tall here, because this is all kind of divine space. It's above worldly space. Sometimes in these lower levels at Lakshmana, you'll find worldly, mundane little narratives going along. Kings, battles, people having sex. But mostly that's somewhere else, and we'll get to that. Here's a good sense of the elevation on the platform. And so you can see there are very clear bands of decoration there that are kind of specific. So this is the kind of platform, and the real temple where the divinities begin to appear is being supported by crouching elephants. See here. And then you get into these spaces, and it's very clearly defined but, in horizontal registers. So something is happening with the meaning from worldly in these bottom lower sections, including reliefs on the platform itself, to above your head, 3 registers of divinities, celestial beings, and gods in niches, to abstract shapes above it, going all the way up to the tower. So there's a kind of clear pattern of form to formlessness in the decoration. You're leaving the earthly world behind. Then you have this band of the celestials, and then you have this formless pinnacle. It also, as you probably know from discussions, they represent the cosmic mountain where heavens and earth meet. And at that point, there's no form, just abstract shapes. This gives you a sense of the temple scale. And the tower, which the tallest tower is always over the central shrine, the womb chamber, or garbhagriha. And as you move around the outside of the temple. And this really is the first mature Nagara temple at Khajuraho, the first mature Khajuraho-style temple. So some details of these kind of what almost look like crags and mountains or buds of coral on a reef, and they're like mini temple towers that bud out from the central tower as a decorative motif. And then as you go inside, there's an interior space. You go through 2 mandapas, 2 pillared halls, and there's what's called a pradakshina, a space for you to walk around the interior shrine. And so there's iconography there that's specific to this particular cult of Vishnu. And then here's the shrine itself. And I think a good comparison for Khajuraho would be Angkor Wat, also dedicated to the god Vishnu, not that much later in date, a couple centuries, in Cambodia, and I would argue that's also a Panchayatana plan, a 5-shrine plan with a central shrine flanked by 4 on the corners. So there's some, and it's coming. The plan's coming out of India for these early. There certainly are a mountain temple, kind of customized as well. But this basic plan of the 4 shrines is an Indian origin. And now the issue that everybody wants to know. So I gave you an article about that where Vidya Deheja just runs down all the possible theories for the imagery. So I guess one thing I would say is that, if you go on the internet and you type in Khajuraho, this is all you're going to see. And so I think a lot of people have the impression it's the entire temple. And I think you saw earlier, it's only 3 registers, of figures. And it's not even all of them that are engaged in such practices. So it's clearly in this realm of these perfect celestial beings. But why are they there? That's a great question. I don't think there's any agreement among scholars of, for sure, what one reason, and there may be multiple reasons, but there's a couple good theories. So we'll get back to this. One is that the sensuousness, this is part of human experience, part of our emotion, and they knew that. They knew what they were doing, that maybe it brings delight, maybe it brings emotion. And so this is a quote from a 12th century composition by a Jain monk, a poem he wrote about a sculpture like this one at Khajuraho, but from a different place. In the temple, a statue of a lady who struggled to hold fast to her girdle as a monkey untied the knot. It made young gallants feel desire and confirmed their steadfast rejection in sensual delights. This is from a monk, right? It disgusted the pious and made old ladies feel embarrassed, while it made young men laugh and young girls wonder. So clearly in the 12th century, they understood and appreciated the multiple ways this erotic imagery would affect multiple kinds of viewers. It was very accepted. The other issue, I think, has to do with Indian cosmology in general. The female is Shakti. That means power. This is the goddess Kali, and there's a sticker of her in a fuse box. And when you need your electricity worked on or pay a bill, you go to the Shakti company. The universe runs on the union of male and female forces, and the power that moves the universe from the very birth of Indian thought is feminine. And so doesn't it make sense to have male and female come together in a symbolic way on a temple? And look what happens when they don't come together. You have that Shakti unchecked. So here's Durga, the goddess, the great goddess, the warrior goddess, holding the weapons of all the male gods because they weren't strong enough to defeat this demon. So she asks them and they give her their weapons, and she's got to go do it because she's the real power. And there's a saying in Sanskrit that for every, Shiva without his Shakti is Shava. And Shava means a corpse. Even the gods are powerless without this union. So you see pairs of figures, Mituna, they're called, and if they're really getting it on, they're sometimes called Maituna, because you put the two vowels together, you get a bigger vowel. And you see this pair of male and female throughout Indian art as a decorative element. The other issue is where you see them, and this is in that article. You really mostly only see at Khajuraho this kind of erotic imagery where the parts of the building come together. The porch and the shrine. One porch and another porch. So it's been proposed, and I think it's a great argument, that there's a visual pun going here. So you have male and female standing alone, but they're conjoining where the building conjoins. It's a pretty good theory. And this is another one that's pretty interesting. These are so stylized these sexual encounters, not really poses that anybody could really do very well if you're a human being. And they're so angular. And could they be based on just geometric designs almost? Is there a visual play of the body in geometry? And if there is, what does the geometry mean? So there are scholars who've looked at this and suggested that these are visual puns that actually hide tantric diagrams. So whether it means tantric practice or really just that the presence of the diagram is auspicious. It's a protective emblem on the building. And I'll tell you, temples, before they started showing some of this imagery, often had things like this prominently displayed: diamonds, geometric forms. So maybe there's something to this theory.
I don't need to be vulgar, but can you just tell me what parts, what bodies I'm seeing in the middle? Like I see a male figure and I see a hand on a leg, but I don't know where the legs go.
I think he's holding, I don't know whose leg this is, but I think he's holding her up, and so you have these, it's probably supposed to be her leg this way and his coming around this way and then holding her here.
His leg, that's his leg. Okay,
That's my guess. It may be, yeah. And then that their limbs are forming these other angles. I don't know, but it's a great article on it, and it seems likely. And then just to say you can't have Shiva without Shakti. So this is the Nataraja Theater in Ahmedabad, famous old theater, and they happened to be showing Charlie's Angels, which translated in India as Shri Shakti, Tri Shakti, the three Shaktis. Badass.
So even though they're a small part of the overall structure, that was the detail that the college board decided to put into there. And is that because that's kind of what the temple is known for? Or does it bring up these, it goes beyond the kind of typical religious imagery, and so they want to talk about that?
Well, I think they probably, I don't know, and the image selection wasn't done with the committees that were involved. So all sorts of things, like if you could get image rights to something, there are all sorts of factors that help pick them. I do think you can't talk about this temple without talking about some of the figural imagery on it. And they were limited in how many details they could show. I would have liked them to have shown the shrine image as well. I think it would have helped. And me too. And I was surprised to see the list. I think they did have to address this in the imagery. I don't know why they chose that particular one. You could have chose one where they were a little less involved, or you could have chose one where they were more involved. But I do think this is the issue with the students that you have to deal. Obviously, if they Google, they're going to find all sorts of imagery here. But do you not teach the most important North Indian temples, this kind of fundamental style of India, because of that? And I don't think you can do that. But I know it's a trick for teachers to deal with this. And so I'm trying to give you some of the possible explanations that you might want to have if this issue comes up.
You guys all Google this? I didn't Google it till a year ago.
And it changed your life.
It was a shocker.
It's a shocker.
It was a shocker. I mean, I thought.
And it's a shame because when you are there, the erotic is the least part of your experience.
You were there with teenage students, so what was their response?
They weren't giggling and laughing. They loved it. They thought it was beautiful. Where they did respond with shock is the lower level of the plinth, the worldly activities, where I don't know what that's supposed to be, but there's a couple erotic scenes on the lower plinth, kind of very crudely done. And nobody could, people walk by that and they're like, what's going on there? And then when you get to the actual temple and walk around it, it's just breathtaking. It seems to make sense visually. Even if you don't know what it means, it works. It's beautiful. That doesn't mean that as soon as you walk out of the compound, somebody isn't trying to sell you like postcards and whatever. But it's not what they're about. They're really beautiful things.
That's an interesting point to bring up with the students. They might look at religion as one strict, one way, and not necessarily in terms of the religious context.
Yeah, and I think it's part of our American Puritanism too, and Hindu, nationalist Puritan. India is kind of, maybe because of the Victorian influence. During the Victorian period, they were horrified by this too. I think they're much more, they much more see it as it fits in their tradition now, but they're not wild and crazy. They're as proper and as anyone else. So it doesn't reflect wild lifestyle in medieval India. It absolutely does not. It clearly was, like that quote from the 12th century indicated, it clearly was a shock to the viewer as well.
I just want to understand, so when you arrive at this site, did you say there really were 80 temples on this site, and there still are?
25
25 on the
in
site
this
still?
town, and about 12 or 15 in this group.
So on this, so you can walk for acres,
Mhm.
and there'll be temples.
Mhm.
Are they all to Vishnu? They all
Different gods.
different deities? And then this particular temple, the Lakshmana temple, is
The state temple to the great first state temple of the newly formed free
is it in the center?
empire. No,
It's
no,
one
and
of
so they
the-
built over time, and so there's a couple earlier things, and then this. I'm opposite of Varaha shrine, which is also very politically motivated, because Vishnu is associated with kingship. He's the one who always comes to save the world. He's a great choice as a royal deity. But later on, they become Shaivite, worshippers of Shiva. So the later temples are goddess temples and Shiva temples. Kandarya Mahadev is the final great temple. And
Is Lakshmana the only one with the erotic imagery, or is that common all over?
it's most common there and it's all over, but it's most common there and at Kandarya Mahadev.
So many of the Khatrava temples have the same.
But if you go across North India, you'll find it in other medieval temples too. It's not that unusual, but those temples are so beautiful. They're always illustrated. And but when you're there, it harmonizes. It really makes sense. I mean, we went with some people who were very religious, and they dealt with it. I do think a part of it is the way we react to things. I heard a story, which you're going to have to edit this if I tell you this. I was recently talking to a colleague. Turn it off. Yeah, who works at the. You've got to cut this. So who works at the Guggenheim, and had been part of a project when they used to do loans to the other Guggenheims with the Hermitage. The world's greatest collections, the royal collection of the Russian czars. I mean, unbelievable collections. And they had the Guggenheim for a while in Las Vegas, Bellagio or somewhere like that. And so they set up this loan agreement to do loans from the Hermitage to Las Vegas. And the Hermitage offered one of their greatest paintings, and it's a Rubens, and it's a mythological scene. Giant painting, stunning, full life-size nude goddess in the painting. One of their treasures. And she was in the room when they went back to and had the meeting with the director to cancel the loan and ask for something else. And he said, "Are you crazy? How insulting. Think about it. We're offering you one of our greatest paintings. It's a world treasure." He said, "But you don't understand. All the school groups come here, and we're not allowed to show nudes. Even in Las Vegas, where everybody's naked." I mean, what the hell? I couldn't believe the story either. You definitely have to cut this. But so they had to, and begrudgingly, they convinced the director to cut the loan and send them a different Rubens. But he was like, "What is wrong with you people? Why can't your children look at this. This is art. This is the greatest art. It's one of the world's greatest things. So I think it's part of it is our culture. And I'm not saying you have to show the sexual encounters, but even just the nude figures there, it's the human body. It's spiritual in India as well as erotic and lyric and whatever. And it's part of the story.
Are all the gods and goddesses in the Hindu, I'm just thinking even the triumvirate, there's a male and a female.
Mm-hmm.
With all of them, Brahma has a female partner, Vishnu,
Mm-hmm.
Shiva.
And when they don't, like Durga and Kali, they're the Shakti, the goddess out of control, and they're extremely dangerous. And when they're with their consort, they're the perfect mother, the perfect lover, they're peaceful, they're beautiful. But when they're alone, they're trouble. So anyway, I know we're out of time. What I could do is just walk through the Jahangir one, because I think that's one you wanted to see. I'll just walk through it. I'm not going to really point out anything. And then you can have I'm sure you all know the Taj Mahal. I gave you a great article on it. And I'll make sure I get a way that you can download the PowerPoint and use it. But let's just walk through. So by the end of the 12th century, Islamic dynasty has now come in and conquered Delhi and established a foothold in India, which becomes the Delhi Sultanate. And you can see that it was able to extend quite a bit of control from Delhi across North India early on. But so a much later dynasty are the Mughals, founded in 1526. And at their greatest height, they'll go almost down to Tamil Nadu, the Chola area, but not quite. And it's under the
Where do Mughals come from? Any Mongol? Like
Mongol. Yeah. So we've got the great Mughal kings. Painting begins under Akbar, the third emperor. There's great interest in European art. They're getting prints through exchange and diplomatic gifts, also paintings, which they have the miniaturists in the copy. So this is where you see a great interest in European art and maybe perspective, atmospheric perspective, and particularly under Jahangir, naturalism. So these are paintings he commissioned from his artist. His father, Akbar, who had this great painting school, had hundreds of artists. He winnowed it down, maybe 20 or 30. And he talked about them in his biography, which he wrote, and talked about who was good at what. And he bragged about himself as a connoisseur, and that if you showed him a painting or drawing, he could pick out the artist. And if a different artist did the face and a different did the hands, he was good enough that he could tell them apart. So Jahangir didn't expand the empire, it contracted under him. He might not have been a great political leader, but he was an amazing connoisseur, collector, and under him, Indian painting kind of culminates because of this infusion of Persian styles, earlier Indian painting, and his intense interest on naturalism and what you could do with painting. So more paintings done under Jahangir by his artists. This one you have, I gave you the Jahangir's description from the Asian reader about the death of his friend Inayat Khan, and on his deathbed he sent one of his artists to capture his likeness. He was dying, he was an opium addict. That became this painting, which is at the Bodleian. This is actually at the MFA in Boston. And this is the standard art history classroom comparison, to have students compare what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses, what can the drawing do that a finished painting cannot, vice versa. And it's incredible. There's also a great interest under Jahangir. Akbar was into manuscripts like the Shahnameh, and Jahangir was interested in albums. Books, beautifully put together books of images and calligraphy. And maybe they didn't tell a story, or maybe they were thematically linked. But rather than illustrated manuscripts of famous narrative stories and histories, he favored the album. So this is an album page from one of Jahangir's albums, and here you see in these beautiful borders a European print, 2 Persian paintings, and another early Iranian painting of a lion, all put together in one composition.
Is that what an album is, or is an album 40 pages bound together?
The album is however many pages, like a scrapbook almost, that you put together.
Just to clarify, are these different paintings that he's cutting and pasting, or is he having artists copy them together?
These were different pieces like scrapbooking, that a print and some Safavid era paintings and an earlier Persian painting that he perhaps told the artist he wanted in the book, and they came up with the presentation. And these albums often have multiple pieces of paper just in the borders. We x-rayed one once when I was at Harvard, a Persian album page that looked like it was probably one composition, only 1 or 2 pieces of paper. It had 40 little tiny strips were individual. This would have been individual. This was taken from another book. Beautifully, carefully put together and glued together. Stunning. So this is the page. You've all probably taught it. But this is the pinnacle of Indian painting, most important of a tradition that's very, very important. And it probably gets that title not just for the beautiful style, but because of the political symbolism. It's just a fabulous combination. The floral border is later. The album was taken from the Mughal libraries in Delhi after a siege by a foreign army named Nadir Shah, and he took it back to Iran. It was remounted in an album format by Persian artists, so this is a later Persian floral border. And eventually the album went to St. Petersburg, where the Rubens was. And so much of it is there. A few of the folios are elsewhere, and a small group of them are at the Smithsonian in the Freer-Sackler, like this piece. So it's, you know the story of Jahangir as this presiding divine figure, right, seated on this European hourglass-shaped throne, receiving a book from this bearded man, and pretty much ignoring the Ottoman Sultan, James I from England, and his artist, Balchan. So it has a self-portrait. So the inscriptions tell us, though outwardly Shahs stand before him, he fixes his gazes on dervishes, meaning the Sufis. So meaning he's not worldly focused. He's a great spiritual leader, and his heart is with the Sufi. And here's the book, and you can see it's one of those leather ones with the Persian medallion in gold on it, beautifully detailed. So who is he? All right. Well, my theory is that he is a portrait of a Sufi from the Chishti order, which is the specific order, just like the Safis that supported the Safavid, or were associated with the Safavid kingdom. The Chishti order was associated with the Mughals. After Jahangir's father would pay visits to a Chishti Sufi at his abode in Fatehpur Sikri, this little area outside of Agra, and he would go to him for spiritual guidance and asking if he would have a son because he had no heir. And that Sufi, Chishti, predicted that he would have a son. And then Salim was born, and Salim became Jahangir. So that came true. Akbar put his faith that this is the lineage, this is my spiritual guide. He went and built his new capital city at Fatehpur Sikri, at the abode of the Sufi, and enshrined him there at his death. And so we find in Jahangir's paintings multiple depictions of these Chishti Sufis. This is the 12th century founder of the lineage, the religious lineage. He is handing a globe of the world over to Jahangir, who's holding a globe of the world. They had the same inscriptions, and these were book pages. This is a spread that faced each other in one of Jahangir's albums. So there's clearly a political link Jahangir is making to this spiritual guidance of the Chishti order. So this is what I would call another example, and this is where this term came from, actually, dervish-centered kingship. And then here we see, this is actually Salim's shrine at Fatehpur Sikri, this beautiful marble shrine. Until, you were only supposed to use marble for a shrine or a tomb of a holy man, spiritual leader, till the Taj Mahal. Well, and Jahangir's father-in-law, and that was a controversy too. But here's Jahangir holding a picture of his father Akbar, kind of offering this globe, worldly power to him. So he was all about the use of portraiture and political imagery to set up kind of propaganda about himself. So is this the founder, Muin al-Din Chishti, an imagined portrait of what he looked like? Or could this be the Sufi who was alive and counseling him, Sheikh Hussein Chishti? We don't know. I wanted to give you something a little different than what you were going to get on Khan Academy, which has a great story on this. And then the idea of the figures, we know James I, there was a portrait of him given to Jahangir in his court through the British ambassador, Thomas Roe, a portrait by John de Kritz. That was probably the source for this portrait. And here's Beechter, the artist, holding up a miniature, and him in the yellow jama bowing before his king and patron. And portraits are rare among the Mughals, and here he signs it, Amal, essentially made by Beechter, on this grotesque multi-headed footstool. Beechter was a Hindu, so could this unusual imagery have something to do with his self-identification? And I didn't notice this till I was working this PowerPoint, but his signature is directly under the book. He would have worked in the great scriptorium where the artists painted and the books were assembled. Oop. The inscription, "O Shah, may your life be 1,000 years," but of course it's not. He's starting to get old. So is this about sadness at the passage of time? Did the Pudi turn away because they can't bear that their brilliant divine leader will die? We don't know what all the symbolism means, but it's great. And this isn't the only allegorical portrait that Jahangir made. So we've got it in 2 albums, the St. Petersburg album and the Minto album. And so here you see the other great thing, and I'll wrap up with this. Here's Jahangir seated with Shah Abbas, the emperor of the Safavids, who moved his capital back to Isfahan around 1600. And they were always weak, but they were the neighbor. If they could ally, they could be one of the most powerful dynasties in the world. They would cover, they'd be a bulkhead, a threat to the Ottomans, threat to the Ming. The Mughals were already one of the greatest empires of the time. That's why all the Europeans were trying to get there. And so it was always Jahangir's dream to make that alliance with Persia. He was married to a Persian woman. His in-law, who was a very high-ranking minister, was Persian. He swayed Persian culturally. He wanted this to happen. So here they are having a meeting. Here they are hugging on the globe of the world together, ruling the world together. Of course, he's the lion, and the Safavids are the lamb, clearly taking biblical symbolism there. Yeah. And unfortunately for him, shortly after these albums were done, I'm trying to remember the date, it's like 1625 or something, the Safavids invaded Afghanistan and took over the Mughal cities and territories to the northwest. And so that ended it. This was a dream, an allegory he put forth, propaganda, if you will, what he wanted to happen, and it didn't. They became clear enemies at that point, and no alliance was ever made. And we'll end with this. So here they are hugging. And how does he know what Shah Abbas looked like? Because he sent his favorite portrait artist to the court with an embassy to Isfahan to meet him and capture his likeness. And this is the first drawing made of Shah Abbas to meet the Indian embassy, the Mughal embassy. And he had just been playing polo on the great Maidan, the great court in the center of his new town. And he got off his horse in loose turban and all dusty and sweaty and walked up and met them. And that's what was drawn of his portrait. And it's by Beechter, the artist of our painting. And so that's what I've got for you. So I'm sorry we didn't get to the Taj, but I figure that's one you all know. And feel free to, I'll give you those outline notes and the PowerPoints on that Dropbox so you can use them as you will. You can also feel free to email questions. And if there's anybody who I didn't get the Google link, or you're not sure you did, if you would write your email down, I'll make sure you get it. So.
Actually, Lou has got all of ours, so if you didn't get it.
Email Lou maybe.
Yeah, let's give it, send the Dropbox to Lou and have him
It was
send
probably called like AP Art History Utah something.
Okay, I don't think.
And it was a
I remember
Google.
getting one that was like reading something.
It could be. It could be. It might have started readings for like AP Art History Utah, something like that. So it's probably if you got if it said readings, that's it.
Okay.
And I'll put this in it.
Great, thank you so much.
Oh, no problem.
Ugh.
Anyway.